Everybody, we're back recording. I have some interesting news. So, wait till Greg gets in. Come on in. We're waiting. All right. So when was it? When were we supposed to do this test?
Never.
Well, you said like the 10th.
The 10th?
10 or the 13th. Yeah.
The 10th would be the Monday.
Or 12th. Is that the Monday after Easter?
10th to the 12th. So I have to give you guys I have to do the review.
Well, that's not my problem. I would.
Can we do the 12th instead of the 10th?
The what?
Can we do the 12th instead of 10th? Or we're going to come back from Easter?
And I have a special offer for you.
All right.
This is and it's strictly because of Chelsea.
What?
Take
We're
an
doing
exam
it
over Easter.
online.
We are doing it online. I want you to know what I spent yesterday after my car on the way home Monday. Smoke coming out the back and smoke coming out. It's only got 240,000 miles. It's a Subaru. That means it's probably about 50.
You're just breaking it in. Yeah, you're just
It's
breaking
a
it in.
Subaru. They go for 300 miles, for 340. The last one went for 238. So, and it was still working when we sold it. So as I drive into and I'm like, I guess the hose blew from the radiator in, and then everything else is, let's say, not working properly. I was going to use a different expression with an F in it. And it was due for inspection anyway, and the guy quoted me something that, he goes, "Are you sitting?" And I'm like, oh, God. So it's I'm going to have it towed. My son's got a buddy who resells high-end cars down in Oakmont. Cool, I think Edgewater. I'll have to show you the link. He's a nice guy, and he does inspections there. So we're gonna see what happens. Because my son can come in and work on it there as well, and he puts cars together or not. So, but nevertheless, so that means I had a lot of time since I couldn't really go anywhere. Now I had to borrow my wife's car, one of her cars.
Wait, this next exam is online or the final?
Well, I if we haven't discussed the final yet. But as you will see it here, tests. Notice, exam 3, I've completed it, which means that we're going to deploy it on Blackboard. So I think there's 55 questions, okay, and I'll allot an hour to do it, and then we'll get the logistics over the course. So I'll try to get the review in, since we've finished the material, maybe Friday, we'll see. Okay. Whatever. All right, all good?
Will we take that during our actual class time, or is it going to be
You
all
could.
day and we have an hour to do it?
Yeah, I'll open a window for a limited amount of time. The way it works with Blackboard is you have a window of login, and you've done them before. Once you log in, you have 60 minutes to complete. You can go back and forth. It's not one of those, move on to the next question, you're done. So, but once you hit, it's a forced completion. So once at 60 minutes, it completes it for you. Or once you say completion, you're done and you see your score. Wait, yeah, we works with yes, ma'am.
So you're gonna do it the 12th?
Quite possibly. Does that work better for you?
Yeah, that's fine.
So you don't have to have, I could have deployed it for you, especially for you.
It's okay. The 12th will be fine.
All right.
Is that what he said?
What? Question?
What's the date of this?
I think we're going to make it the 12th because everybody seems to be insistent.
Thank you.
It's online.
I thought you said Friday. And I was like,
I thought it was going to be this Monday because next week, and I didn't know I didn't know about Good Friday because I've been in schools where they have worked it and where they haven't worked it. We
I
used
think
to,
last year we did. Yeah,
when we were kids, half day Thursday, and then you didn't come back till like the Tuesday. It's a long. We went to school till like the 20th of June. We started like right after Labor Day, and you went to. It's just calendar was so much different than it was New Jersey, not the Pennsylvania 180-day calendar thing. So will you relay that to your partner in crime, Chelsea? She'll respond when she's ready. Whenever you're ready, dear. I'm sorry. All right. Well, Mackenzie's the only one who, if she's there, good. All right. Let's begin. We're going to get back to kidneys are us. So let us begin. So I am recording and everybody has the information. And this is kind of where more or less a good stopping point. Thank you very much. That's right. I had one of those. Yesterday was one of those days. Okay. So these processes, as we talked about, filtration, reabsorption, and secretion are, from a definitional standpoint, or even from a future like GREs or MCATs, those are the three functions. I always believe that when we get to it, the countercurrent exchange and multiplier system, it should be a part of that as well, but that's just me. So you can see it here. And again, the afferent arterioles in general are a little bit wider, and that's really where most of the control is. So the whole idea from a physiologic standpoint, if you open that afferent arteriole, and very often as a companion, it closes somewhat the efferent arteriole, it means the fluid lingers in the glomeruli longer. And what that does is it makes more filtrate. And it's just a function of the amount of filtrate. 99% is absorbed. So if you make an extra 5% of filtrate, you're going to end up with 5% more urine. And that means you're going to lose 5% more water effectively over what you would have used under normal. So it's all about that. So and those are inherent controls. Physiologically, the kidney controls itself as long as your blood pressure isn't exceedingly low or exceedingly high. It all has to do, and this is an important one for the exam you're taking, that MAP. The mean arterial pressure, the difference between systolic and diastolic by a third of that, what they call the pulse pressure, and then add that to the diastolic and you have the mean arterial pressure. And so what happens now when it enters, now as it enters, we have resorption and secretion going on. It depends on where. So as you'll see, the bulk of the resorption and secretion occurs right away in the proximal convoluted tubule. Probably 2/3 of everything that the kidney does is pretty much accomplished, certainly in the cortical nephrons, the ones where it's all about resorbing and secreting, mostly done there. A lot of times, the kidneys will resorb materials they're going to secrete later to create gradients and utilize things like secondary active transport. Okay, so they'll artificially create gradients to be transported out later. So there's a lot of unique activities associated with kidneys in that regard. So when they talk about peritubular capillaries, by definition, those are the capillaries. So once that occurs, and it's an energy-dependent process, you can see the transition from arterial blood to venous blood. Voila. Filtration is passive. It's passive because of pressure gradient that's there. Resorption really doesn't occur until it gets into the capillary system itself. And then we see the idea of the fenestrated, the fused basal lamina, and those podocytes are foot processes that can control the diaphragms of the slits and even can repel certain macromolecules. So it can be very, very selective in that regard. So I thought that in itself was interesting as well. And this is very much of a drawing taken from a micrograph. It looks just like that. You can see, these are a very unique capillary with the fenestration, with these processes, with these slits that really give you an idea. And inherently, there's a little bit of suction pressure in this that assists. It's not the major force. The major force here is just like we see in a regular capillary bed. The major force is hydrostatic pressure in the afferent arteriole, because that's the one that's got most of the juice in it, so to speak, the power in it, and which is has a sufficient amount once it gets to that level to overcome the colloid osmotic pressure, what the force that the proteins and formed elements are exerting on the water to hold it in. So when you get enough of a difference, and it's roughly maybe 8 units, okay, like 8 millimeters of mercury, however they're defining it, that's sufficient for stuff to basically outflow. And then just the proximal column. So there it is. You can see these, the filtration slits, the podocytes, etc. These are the little fenestrations. You want to call them perforation. Fenestration literally means window. Here's the actual micrograph where they took that drawing from. That's there. And so you can see what's going on. So just like in the lung, interestingly enough. So you have basically a basement membrane structure that's somewhat fused between the capillary level and where the filtrate is going. So, and you can see the slits that are there. You can see the blood that's there, the fenestrations, and then the fenestrations allow it to flow in, and the slit dimensions sort of control the amount of flow. Okay. And as you can see, there are some of them get stuck and they're engulfed, some of these macromolecules that are there. So typically water, glucose, amino acids, nitrogenous waste, little stuff. Bigger doesn't get through. Kidneys, relatively speaking, they function very, very well. I mean, it really takes extremes. So again, when I ended up in ICU, it was an extreme condition. I had, like I said, I was in big trouble. I was near death with that kind of a thing, which was shocking. And again, it's just, there are limited times when those things really speak to you. Of course, I was trying to take over for for what they call the intensivist. That's the intensive doctor. That was the occasion when I had. It's an interesting story. I threw a doctor out of my room in intensive care. I had an infection with salmonella. They didn't know it was salmonella, but it was clearly an infection. And she comes in there with no personal protective equipment. She had no gloves, no mask, not a gown, just an old lab coat. And I told her in no uncertain terms, accented with a certain amount, to get her rather corpulent posterior out of my room without putting too fine a point on it. In those terms, I didn't say corpulent posterior. Obese donkey. Just saying. So moving on. So the proteins and the formed elements are there. Okay. And because of that, there's a certain, you can't lose all that. So there's enough fluid, I think, in my concept of it as I visualize it, to allow this now thicker blood, if you will, to flow. So without clogging up the works. Okay. That's where it is. So, and they do the pressures here. So as you can see, that's why that wide entry artery is so critical, because by the time it gets, with all those branching, by the time millions of branches, by the time it gets to arterial, it still has 55 millimeters of mercury compared, which is more than twice as much at a typical capillary bed in tissue. If you had that much pressure in tissue, that's the kind of thing that happens when, I may have commented on it before, when we put a tourniquet on, like for extremity surgery, well, we're very careful to have it release slowly, because that pressure head that builds up would tear through structures. So it's an inordinately high, but these vessels are designed, okay? The efferent arteriole has high resistance with a diameter smaller. So it's a design activity. And then they go through the differences in the pressures that are there, the pressure in the capsular spate and the space, that kind of is pushing back. The colloid osmotic pressure is holding it back. It's about 45 to 55, pushing it out, net of 10. That's the GFR, and that's the big factor when we look at physiology, and the definition of kidneys that function or do not function well is GFR, glomerular filtration rate. When we are really truly doing kidney analysis to see, we don't necessarily use those ones you see on the blood test. Those are estimated GFR. The real thing is done, it may be done differently today. It was a long time ago when we ordered these. The way you had to collect them was you gave somebody a substance that was there was a plant polysaccharide that was called inulin. And you'll see that at the end of the chapter, that was neither absorbed nor secreted. So basically you gave them a certain amount and you knew how long it would take to get through, and you just measured it. But the only way to measure it was called 24-hour urines. So you had to collect your urine for 24 hours, which is, not necessarily the most pleasant task. A little easier in a hospital environment, obviously. Okay. And there you see the pressures that are there. And so the rate formed per minute together with both kidneys is around 125. There's a wide range before we start to get worried. Okay. And the filtration pressure, the surface area, how well the membranes are permeable, as you would guess, those are all fairly intuitive factors, things that, you should make sense to you right away. And most of it is governed by intrinsic controls. Intrinsic controls by far and away maintain that. Okay. The extrinsic controls are when we have, because of extremes or significant variations, where we have to bring in the autonomic nervous system, or we have to bring in certain chemical hormone substances to control it. So it affects us, and obviously the big player is systemic blood pressure. So if we increase the amount of filtration, that's what I was saying before, we increase the amount of urine. The more urine, it's a fluid-filled container. And the amount of fluid is what generates the pressure. If you reduce the volume of fluid, you reduce the pressure. If you hold back some of the fluid or decrease it, you increase the pressure. It's fairly straightforward. And forever and a day, before we had these, as I've told you, the way that we used to treat these problems was very much fluid. It was diuretics. But they have a lot of pitfalls, and now you see them probably used more in a hospital sense to try to get things in line relatively quickly rather than long term. So you'll see that. So here we call them auto-regulation. Keeps it, notice the range of the mean arterial pressure. That's pretty darn long. I mean, if somebody's got, 110/70, which a lot of women have normally, okay, they typically low pressure is not a problem. Your GFR is about 8, your kidneys are working fine. Or if you get somebody who's likely heading for a stroke, and has something like 200/140, your kidneys are still going to be subject to auto regulation. Just as a for instance, they would still be in that range. So it has to, when we talk about malignant hypertension, at least was the diagnosis way back, maybe it's the same one. It suggests that that malignant hypertension has gone above that, and the universal term we use when it's below it, shock. And the definition of shock is the circulatory system is not getting blood and oxygen to vital areas so they can survive. So here they comment on these means, either muscle-based or feedback-based mechanisms. Most of these are just stretch receptors. Smooth muscle contracts reflexly. So if you stretch it, it's on you. It's like those. I'm considered, as you might have noticed, I'm a little older than you are. We used to use something that's now pejorative. It was like those Chinese finger traps. You know what I'm talking about? It's pejorative. Now there would be Asian finger enclosures, even Asian digital enclosures. Just trying not to be pejorative. And it's just kind of like that. You put your finger in there and it squeezes on it. You can't get it out. It's a politically correct world.
Those things were scary as a kid.
Oh, yeah.
You could lose a thumb really easily.
Oh, yeah. You're like, oh my God, I'm going to die. It's like putting into something, grabbing something in a jar and you can't get your hand out. Let go of the candy. If you were lucky, you had parents like my parents. Who were like that. My parents were all bark and no bite, thankfully. But boy, could they bark. So it stretches, and what happens is the afferent arteriole limits the flow, protective in nature. Blood pressure, because what's causing it to be stretched is high blood pressure. So even, and there's normal fluctuations. I say it all the time. Temperature, blood pressure, pulse. There's snapshots. In a hospital, you're monitoring them continuously. So you're getting a more dynamic picture rather than and so you can't judge. To make the diagnosis of high blood pressure, you have to take those readings over a considerable period of time. Same thing with heart disease. I don't know if they still do it now. They used to have a device that you wore for like 24 hours on your chest that had basically the leads on it, and it would record everything. Well, gee, if they were looking for an arrhythmia. Okay. And then what would happen is you come back to the doctor's office, they'd remove it, and they'd study it. And you just map, I sneezed, I went to the bathroom, I had dinner. That, events so they could time them. Those kinds of things. Oh, its name escapes me, but I'll get there. I know my wife had to have one when there were some concerns over that, my first wife. Flow-dependent mechanisms directed by, now this is the feedback system from the juxtaglomerular. So there's two things that impact it. Pressure sensors that were in there and chemosensors for salt concentration. If the glomerular filtration rate increases, filtrate flow increases, it limits resorption time, so you get higher amounts of salt if it's going through there too fast. So what happens, because you're having too much salt in there, now it limits the flow of the filtration pressure and in more time for salt resorption. And obviously opposite, if it's going in the opposite, if it's not enough, then we'll change it around. So if they're high levels or they're low levels, they'll just reverse the process. Extrinsic controls are think of they're an override. Number one in the hit parade, and the only one that impacts the kidney, not the parasympathetic, because the kidney is all about blood vessels, and the only thing that governs blood vessel diameters is the sympathetic nervous system. So that's normally at rest. That's an area that your sympathetic nervous system is just keeping its regular tone. Yes.
Okay, so whenever sympathetic kicks in, it's like fight or flight.
Right,
Okay,
exactly.
the kidney shut off.
It limits the flow to just enough to keep them viable. So if you remember that chart we had with in the blood vessel unit, during vigorous physical activity, you're reducing the flow, you're increasing blood flow everywhere by a factor of 3, but you're reducing the flow to the kidney by about a third from its original. So you really are just getting a sufficient amount of blood to go through it. You check back that chart that's in that chapter 18.
Okay.
In the last part of it, there's that guy who always looks to me like Heinz Ward shooting a basketball.
Okay.
Yeah. So that sympathetic nervous system, low blood pressure, norepinephrine, epinephrine, vasoconstriction, constricts the afferent arterioles, decreases the glomerular filtration rate. And because of that, we're going to have, since there's not enough blood, we're not going to be losing fluid. It will increase it. And then, of course, famously, the renin-angiotensin mechanism. This is what we employ most when we have significant larger fluctuations that are there. Okay, so here we are. The renin system, and again, it's one N. If it looks on the test like I put 2 N's with that name, and it's in kidney, it's not that. It's renin like RENIN. Before I put the test active, I try to go back and look for spellings and typos. I don't always get them. That's why, for me, when you do Blackboard tests with me, you just text me for 2 reasons. One, I don't want to talk to you.
You could FaceTime. I'm a group FaceTime call.
You have no. Can I give you an aside FaceTime? My first wife is a wonderful person. Wonderful person. So my daughter-in-law sends out all these wonderful pictures of the kids to about 5, 6 of us. For some reason, she does not. She's technically disabled. She must have hit the FaceTime button, and she didn't know how to not hit it. So every time she tried to contact one of us, it was group FaceTime. One time I answered it, so all of a sudden, oh, there she is. Oh, hi. Did you FaceTime me intentionally? I don't know how to stop. That was yesterday afternoon. Which is fine. It's crazy. But then she's older than I am by about 3.5 months. I can understand it. Moving on. So what happens? The sympathetic nervous system can direct, if it's active, if that's going to be engaged, renin's going to be released. Okay. if the if the salt concentration rather is low, it'll stimulate renin. Okay, because we know we're going to have to stop losing it. And if there's not enough stretch, so stretch receptors are there as well. All of those are significant steps. And at that point, the renin mechanism gets into it. And it's just an interesting chart. But again, there's 4 ways that the renin angiotensin aldosterone mechanism works. The most important to understand that angiotensin, which is activated, so the pathway, and where they show it here, you saw it previously, renin is a catalyst. It doesn't really have primary actions. It activates a circulating protein in the bloodstream called angiotensin OJ, inactive precursor, to angiotensin 1. That has limited effects, but some. As the blood circulates to your lung, there's an enzyme in your lung as the blood passes through called ACE. I hate to use the initials because that used to stand for acetylcholinesterase inhibitor. This ACE inhibitor is an angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitor. And so for a long time, I took a blood pressure medicine and still do that kind of impacts this pathway. Okay. And there were other medicines that were more, I took one called lisinopril, which directly blocked or limited that pathway. So in the lung, it gets converted to its most active form, angiotensin 2. Letter, it could be a number 2, a Roman numeral 2, it doesn't matter how it's communicated. That has 4 major activities. Its name tells you activity number 1. It tenses the blood vessels, makes the arteries more taut. That elevates blood pressure. Number 2, it activates the release of antidiuretic hormone, vasopressin, from your posterior pituitary. That agent immediately inserts into the collecting ducts, as you'll see as we go through the lecture, basically protein openings that reclaim water. So water is, by definition, pulled back. Just water. We're not talking about sodium yet. Okay. It activates thirst. That's 3. And lastly, and perhaps most significantly, as it's the main agent in all of this, it activates the release of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. The aldosterone, again, inserts into the collecting duct or distal convoluted tubules openings that reclaim sodium. And again, where sodium goes, water is sure to follow. Everywhere the sodium went, the water is sure to go. Okay. I'm going to do another one of those routines very soon. Nobody's paying attention today. You're all in another world. The MCAT guys heard this before, so you're entitled. I told you that one. Oh, Goldilocks, bears, right? What does that mean? And that's that's a pejorative term anyway. That's one of those, an interesting tale. All I can think of is Goldilocks, home invasion. She's trashing the poor bear's house. What did the bears do to her? Breaking and entering, trashing, eating her food, sleeping around. It's not quite like sleeping around Beauty, but then what is? I won't even get into the dwarves, which are the little people.
There's no dwarves in the 3 bears.
Oh, I'm talking about Snow White.
Are you saying all cinematic universe? You saying their name?
Yeah, Disney. I don't know. When I took my kids to see The Little Mermaid when it first came out, and they were little, oh my God.
That would have been a ball. That would have been crazy.
My kids were a little off anyway, so they probably enjoyed it. Moving on. So renal cells, other chemicals that have local effects. You should know these. Adenosine, prostaglandin E. So what they do is, and that's part of the stimulation that we do when we block that with caffeine. Okay, adenosine tends to relax things. When we block it with caffeine, typically it ends up not unblocking it, so we tend to have to go to the bathroom or urinate more. Okay, some cells even make their own angiotensin 2 that reinforces. There's a lot of little subtle nuances, and you can look through all this stuff that's there. When someone is there's fancy terms. Oh, lessening urine is called oliguria. That means few or limited. Where anuria implies you're not putting enough fluid to water Aunt Millie's petunias. You're basically, when someone is anuric, that's an ounce and a half a day. That's somebody whose kidneys are in trouble. That's kind of where I was on that. So the glomerular blood pressure was too low to allow filtration. They result from a lot of things: acute nephritis, transfusion reactions, because those blood byproducts, those antigen antibody complexes, damage the glomeruli. Anything that inflames it, that's kind of what was. Mine was more shock related, crush injury, so it sort of indirectly caused it. So that basically takes us through some of the basics on kidney flow that are there. And we get more into the nuggets of physiology. And I'll spend a little time at the end discussing, really what urinalysis is all about. And it's such a useful test because it's non-invasive. It's easy to get a sample, and it's easy to test a sample to get a snapshot again. So, I mean, anything like that where we don't have to do invasive, even sticking a needle to somebody to get blood, anytime you're violating that barrier, you're effective statistically of an increased risk of infection or complication. I don't know about you. I've gotten a lot of blood tests done, and boy, some of those folks are bad. Moving on. So, tubular reabsorption. Again, roughly 2/3 of this material is returned to the blood. Okay. Organic nutrients resorbed. Water and ion resorbed and then regulated and adjusted. They're both active and passive in nature. Okay. A lot of the passive might even be secondary to the active that are there. And they can either go through the cells, or those cells have little openings between them. That's paracellular. So you have transcellular directly through. It doesn't imply that it's being processed. That's just the pathway. The paracellular certainly is not going through the cells, but adjacent to them. So again, you can see what they're defining here as resorption. Transcellular enters apically, travels through, exits in the base or on the lateral aspect, and then enters those mostly the peritubular capillaries. Because we're going to see when we get to the juxtamedullary capillaries and the concentration gradient's a bit different. Limited tight junctions, somewhat leaky in the proximal area of the nephron. Look at the things: water, calcium, magnesium, potassium, some sodium in the proximal convoluted tubule move via this route. So there's a lot of players that are just have the ability to get through it. There's a considerable amount of flow, considering you're processing during the day 180. It's got to be moving pretty fast. 180 liters of fluid. So they're showing you whether it's filtrate in the tubular lumen, tight junctions versus transcellular versus paracellular, and then entering the limited amount of space and finally being reabsorbed in the peritubular capillaries. Okay. So this is the interesting. This is what I mean about where co-transport that we talked about plays, and in the MCAT, you guys, they talked a little bit about that with Dr. Hillwig the other day. Sodium is a big player. Proportionally, we have more sodium than anything else. So as it's being moved, we utilize that power of movement to bring other things along for the party. Okay, it just makes it easier. And sometimes we use the backflow from stuff going in, and the analogy I always talk about is like the undertow of the ocean, particularly the Atlantic, where waves come in and they rush back out. So you can bring stuff along with it. You could be like the surfer longer. In my day and age, my kid boogie boarded like crazy. I had danger makers, which is why did you ever do BMX bike riding and jumps and stuff?
I'm not crazy enough.
Yeah, that's why my kid had 3 knee surgeries by the time he was 17, including an ACL repair. He was doing a backflip. He was doing he was a dirt jumper.
Yeah.
The guy his idol, such a wonderful guy named Dave Mira, and he committed suicide at about age 40. I mean, he rode with him. He rode with a lot of a couple of guys who were at the X Games and things like that. So he's pretty talented.
The most dangerous thing I'll do is snowmobiling. So
The most dangerous thing I do is watching TV.
you ever snowmobile? It's fun.
I have not. I have toboggans.
Okay. That's even crazier. You can't stop. There's no brakes. Snowmobile.
We
you
used to
slow down.
one of the most restrictive and at the time one of the most limited golf clubs, like Oakmont was, like Augusta National, and they've had at least 4 U.S. Opens and recently a couple of PGAs. Baltusrol in my hometown, Springfield, New Jersey. We would, when it snowed, in the fence out by far away from the clubhouse, we used to run in there with toboggans, and because the tees were tiered, we'd go down them. Then the people who would work there would chase us off. We'd run through the hole, and as soon as they were gone, we'd go back out. And finally, they started letting us right by the first hole, the famous first hole. That is a very, very famous golf course. It was so restrictive. Until they changed, they didn't allow minorities or women until they couldn't hold these big events until they began to change. That included Augusta National and Oakmont. So Baltusrol and Oakmont have held the most. Pebble is privately owned. Yeah, so it's a public course. We've played at Pebble. You want to get over this? I think my boys paid for it. They paid for the two dads. I think it was either $500 or $600 for a round. They just paid that down at the TPC, the one with the island green,
Yeah.
down in
Sawgrass,
Jacksonville.
yeah.
It's Sawgrass.
Jacksonville, right?
Yeah, they just paid $500. They said, "Dad, you want to go?" But we're not paying. I said, "No, I don't want to pay $500 to hit 3 dozen balls in the water."
Those be the Pro Vs. They became Pro Vs.
Yeah, Pro V1, just what I want to use.
Exactly.
Moving on. So the old course at St. Andrews was a lot because that's a wonderful. Moving on. So sodium transports typically through the cell, primary active transport, sodium potassium pumps. The sodium flows in bulk, but it utilizes at that surface secondary active or co-transport, and then facilitated diffusion. Basically, that is almost like a form of it, as we talked about, as it's co-transport as it comes in, somewhat facilitated diffusion as it goes out. So, and what we see, low intracellular sodium levels that facilitate sodium going in, but the potassium leaks out. So what happens is that as the potassium leaks out, it also pulls sodium in with it. So there's a lot of things that facilitate the movement of sodium. So it's the primary active transport force. Secondarily, this creates an electrochemical gradient, not unlike the proton motive force. Okay, so and that gradient gives it a little push to push stuff out at the basolateral as it's exiting. Glucose, amino acids, ions, and vitamins, all the things that we shouldn't be seeing in the urine are brought back in principally by them. So that's another important little nugget that's there. Sodium and water following each other. Water fairly easy by the aid of aquaporins, but there's a certain inducing component. So the aquaporins are always present in the proximal, and when they talk about facultative, these are inserted particularly by antidiuretic hormone. The distinction with aldosterone is those are really additional sodium channels, and the water moves secondarily to it. So that's another neat little thing that goes on. So all these things are important because, frankly, from a clinical standpoint, blood pressure is a very, very common problem. There's so many people that have it for a variety of reasons. Some of it is easily taken care of, as we spoke, by lifestyle changes. Eat better, don't have too many bad habits, exercise, and likely I used to joke when I used to go to my old family doctor. She's a lovely lady. She helped me through my family doctor when I was quite ill all those times. And I used to joke. I go walk in and see the person at the desk, give them the copay, and I say, "Lose weight, stop smoking." And walk out the door. It's what she's going to tell me anyway. Here's your copay. Tell them I showed up. So, passive tubular resorption. Okay. So, concentration gradients for solutes, as you're going to see, also occurs. Fat soluble substances, ions, and urea follow water into those peritubular capillaries also by concentration gradients. So the big problem is this. A lot of, and this is something in clinical work, a lot of pharmaceuticals are reabsorbed, and that means they increases their lifespan. So if you're going into a medically based field, this is one of the things that you become aware of with certain things you prescribe. You want to know what someone's kidney function is to see if they're going to clear it out or if they're not going to clear it out. Is it going to be reabsorbed? Is it active when it's reabsorbed? Are there breakdown products we call active metabolites? Are they also present? There's a lot of nuances to that. So unfortunately, a lot of these things aren't removed very easily. Okay, so and that's why a lot of things over time have been removed. It's like some of the pesticides that were used were effectively a kind of an environmental pollutant, and they were removed. And you still, and again, all those lawyers on TV that you see constantly with whatever that ortho stuff that was made by whoever was making it. Was it 3M?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, an insecticide. And I love 3M products, in general. But I mean, they're just once it's the class action. It's the same thing with that terrible train derailment in Ohio.
Oh yeah.
And now 48,000 lawyers are all looking to make a buck.
Yeah, that happened. Not happened to me, but there was like the CSI kit that had like really bad substances in it, and I played with that for like years.
Oh God, is that why?
What?
Nothing.
It was like a CSI crime scene kit. It explains a lot. Yeah. But like it was like all over my toys, everything. I said, wow, like this powder is getting everywhere. It turns out it's cancer. So.
Hey.
But also, like our elementary school was condemned for like black mold and stuff. So if I'm gonna get it, I'm already toast. Middle school, elementary school, both destroyed. So.
I shared this with you once. We didn't wear gown in the ER. We didn't wear gowns.
Yeah.
We didn't wear gloves. We didn't wear masks routinely. Not like you see on TV. That changed in 1994. So it was 30 years ago. I mean, I started working in ERs in 1977. Somebody came in bleeding. You put your bare hand over it to stop the bleeding.
That's crazy. Yeah.
What are you talking about?
Yeah,
I mean, if somebody's got bones sticking out, you want to cover it. I mean, it's instinctive.
That's how it was. Like, there's just messes everywhere.
In 1970, when I was doing 71, when I was doing organic chemistry, we're working with aniline dyes and piperidine dyes. I was a chemistry major. You got them on your hands, then you're using a solvent like DMSO or acetone, which is deuterated. DMSO is more like dimethyl sulfoxide, and acetones, and they're great organics, right through into your body. I'm going to be 72 in May. Okay. So they're just showing you a little bit about what goes on. We don't have to go through that at length. The last nugget for today. I talked about it in diabetes. This is where we took. Hi, everybody. Nice seeing you. Goodbye. I haven't seen you so long, Kate. Forgot what you look like. See, unlike you, they appreciate me.
I appreciate
How did
it.
you say that?
They're not. They don't have your personality.
I know.
I'm joking. I'm user friendly. I try to be. Look, I can't deal with it anymore. So TMs, transport maximums, every resorbed substance. There's only a limited number of carriers. The big player is glucose. And the trouble is once those carriers are occupied by an overabundance of glucose, they can't transport it anymore. It spills, the term we use, into the urine. So that's a byproduct of diabetes, particularly with higher levels. And the longer they are saturated, they become less efficient. So the transport maximum, when it is saturated over time, gradually decreases. So if you're running at a blood sugar of 185, sooner or later that blood sugar is going to go up because the transport is limited. You're poisoning those transporters. So roughly 2/3 of everything, nutrients, 65% of sodium water, lots of ions, the uric acid, half the urea, which we secrete out later, proximal convoluted tubules. They're the workhorse. We'll stop here at the nephron loop because that's where we start to get into the countercurrent aspect of things. That's a lecture unto itself. Thank you very much. See you on Friday.